I'm Fida Adely, and I'd like to welcome you to our third panel. But before we begin that, I first want to introduce the Dean of the School of Foreign Service, Carol Lancaster, who'd like to welcome you all and say a few words about our colleague Farouk Tabak. Thank you, Carol.
One of the problems of high podia and large Apple computers is that I disappear behind them, so I might just stand beside here. Just to say a brief memory of Farouk. Farouk is a good friend of mine. I was so sad when he passed away. He was a gentle man, a very studious man, very kind man, and I think we all continue to miss him, those of us who knew him and were friends of his. And so I think this wonderful conference is a fitting memory of him, a recollection of him, a celebration of the work that he did. And so I just want to say thanks to the various programs, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and the other programs, and his friends here on the faculty for putting this together, and to all of you for coming to what I think, from what I've seen of the program, is a really interesting and important conference. So just to say the School of Foreign Service is very pleased to have this conference taking place, to remember one of our wonderful colleagues, to look at the Mediterranean with different eyes, and to consider what it was and what it is. And so I'll be very interested to hear the conversation here and the discussion of the panel. Thank you all for being here, and thanks again for to the panelists and to the organizers.
Great, so we'll begin our third panel, and we'll continue to follow the same format that the panels have been following throughout the day. And the theme of this third panel is Currents of Connectivity, Ecology, Ideology, and Interaction. And I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Osama Abi-Mershed from Georgetown.
Thank you, Fida. It's good to be here. All right, so yes, the panel's called, it has the word ideology in it, connectivity, ecology, ideology, and I think I'm going to focus on the ideology part. And I will talk about the Saint-Simonians. They were mentioned yesterday by Professor Burke, and my ears always perk up when someone mentions the Saint-Simonians because they're largely forgotten for some reason. And obviously I must begin by asking the question, so who were these Saint-Simonians? They weren't privateers, at least not in the classical sense. And I've really taken to refer to them as France's inconspicuous revolutionaries, because at the core of their doctrine we find on one side an agenda for radical social and political change, and on the other a deeply pronounced and often voiced aversion to the slightest hint of social and political turmoil. Indeed, the Saint-Simonian doctrine was essentially an elitist intellectual response to the violent upheavals in late 18th century France. In his first pamphlet, Letters from an Inhabitant of Geneva to His Contemporaries, which was published in 1803, the founder of the movement, the fellow you see behind me, Henri de Saint-Simon, outlined his vision to replace the divisive social hierarchies in France with a more legitimate and conciliatory political order dominated by individuals who were distinguished by their industry. And industry is a term that Saint-Simon used to designate any productive activity that contributed to the improvement of society and to the organic unity of humankind. The society of the future, Saint-Simon claimed, was to be raised on principles of productivity and cooperation and governed by a secular priesthood comprising the nation's leading industrialists, financiers, savants, and technocrats. The Saint-Simonian doctrine was bound to attract the interest of the discontented intelligentsia of Restoration France and its new generation of social elites that had grown tired of their country's trending cycle of national glory and euphoria followed by defeat and desolation. To the leaders of post-revolution France, fearful of ideological populism and the potency of mass mobilization, Saint-Simon had painted an alternative cohesive social order structured according to personal merit and governed by eminent representatives of industry and banking, science, and the beaux-arts. So here was a program that predicted the end of class conflict and the emergence of a more rational and harmonious polity, differentiated but still united by the productive associations between its different social strata. Saint-Simon assured his readers that in the coming industrial age, all privileges of birth, without exception, shall be abolished, to each according to one's capacity, to each capacity according to its labor. The industrial society would consequently finalize the true promise of 1789 and dispose of the lingering discordant remnants of the Ancien Régime. And in the course of the 19th century, Saint-Simon's social political theories would inspire generations of talented Frenchmen of letters, science, and finance. And here's just a, can you see this? Just to give you this is a genealogy of the Saint-Simonian family. And you can see that among these luminaries, you have individuals such as Auguste Comte, Augustin Thierry, Prosper Enfantin, Hippolyte Carnot, and then our man, the fellow I've circled because I'm going to be talking about him today, Michel Chevalier, who perhaps is best remembered as architect of the 1860 Cobden Chevalier Free Trade Agreement with Britain, but who interests us today as the foremost exponent of the Saint-Simonian movement's Mediterranean dream. And to this extent, Chevalier is an appropriate figure through which to assess Terry Burke's description of the Mediterranean as the first recipient of the 19th century liberal reform project in its political and economic forms, and as a good site from which to begin the process of rethinking European modernities in the plural. And as I'm reminded of the exchange that took place yesterday between Terry Burke and Nabil Matar, it seems to me that the liberal project or the Enlightenment project does need to be deconstructed. I mean, we learned yesterday that a lot of stuff goes into that liberal project, and the Saint-Simonians have their own package. And to me, it seems that the liberal project, in fact, becomes a project because of its power to co-opt, enforce, and eventually subdue. The civilizing mission, whether it justifies nation-making or colonial expansion, is pretty much a liberal project. And if we take now into consideration Henri Lefebvre's theories on the production of social space, then the destruction of a rival's port city, it seems to me not to be too much different from blasting a highway through the mountains. And this is just, I'm digressing, but I'm responding to some of the observations that I heard yesterday. Anyway, back to Chevalier. He becomes a devout follower of the Saint-Simonian doctrine, not surprisingly, in the days following the traumatic events of July 1830. He served as editing director of the Saint-Simonian broadsheet, Le Globe, from January 1831 until the journal was seized by the authorities in April 1832. And underneath the heading of Le Globe, you can see the Saint-Simonian credo, right, to each according to one's capacity. In his brief time at the helm of Le Globe, Chevalier authored a handful of articles labeled collectively Système de la Méditerranée, in which he outlined a socio-physiological notion of the Mediterranean world, centered on the linkages between technological innovation and socio-political development. Now, schematically, Chevalier's Mediterranean world is a living organism. Like any biological entity, it consists of various subsystems, each performing distinct vital functions, and altogether integral to the subsistence and survival of a larger organic system. And the greater organic unit in this regard is humanity, as I will discuss later. But the subsystems are, in Chevalier's words, the various natural zones of industry in Europe. These zones of industrial production are an outgrowth of European political and scientific achievements. They share in common the reality that their landscapes have been reconfigured by the growth of manufacturing centers and by the large-scale movement of goods and people over canals, waterways, and now increasingly, and this is key to Chevalier's Système de la Méditerranée, now increasingly movement over railways. Zones of industry behave like anatomical organs. They are generally situated in large river basins and are connected by ground and water transport networks, like blood veins and nerves, to a maritime outlet, a port city that serves as the pulsating heart in the circulation of men and merchandise. And when these disparate partial systems of industry are linked together by a constructed grid of railway lines, waterways, and trunk routes, they form a general system. And Chevalier here is urging European governments to exploit emerging technologies, especially steam engines and telegraph cables, to link the continent's various subsystems of industry and thus bring about the integrated Mediterranean system. He quickly sketches the exponential impact of such integration to the development and prosperity of European agriculture, mineral exploitation, manufacturing industry, and infrastructure. But Chevalier's main selling argument, where he is true to his Saint-Simonian creed, is in his insistence on the political and moral dimensions of this industrial integration. For while transport and telegraph lines may establish physical links between the partial systems, there's an equally significant spiritual corollary to the growing contacts between them. And Chevalier is categorical that steam engines should not be appreciated for their technical prowess alone, nor should they be valued merely for their economic utility. For such perspectives, overlook the capacity of rail transport by its sheer velocity to multiply contacts between different cultures and thus mediate between the material progress of human societies and their moral improvement. Railways for Saint-Simonians were the very embodiment of the technological spirit of the positive age. And for Chevalier as well, they were, to quote him, the most perfect vehicle for universal association, which he claimed is only possible between peoples who can materially pour into one another and really live the lives of each other. With speeds approaching, and here I'm quoting Chevalier again, speeds approaching the fabulous rate of 40 kilometers an hour in 1832, the new locomotives promised to unite the industrial regions of Europe in concrete terms and renew their societies in intangible ways. Railways, Chevalier concluded and predicted, will transform the conditions of human existence. Now, in practical terms, Chevalier translates the spiritual and moral transformation of human existence into two programs of action. The first aims to achieve, with industrial integration and networks of connectivity, the political federation of European states. And the main dividend to be paid by the industrial integration of Europe is perpetual peace. There is a sustained and adamant anti-war message in the Système de la Méditerranée. And Chevalier argues repeatedly in his articles that the economic investment in industry, credit, and communication will not only enhance international cooperation, but will also transform and, more importantly, moderate the political temperament of European states. For Chevalier, industry is eminently pacific. It instinctively rejects war. What creates, he writes, cannot reconcile with what kills. Moreover, peace in Europe is especially desirable for France, who, by the revolutionary passions of its people, has been led down the Via Dolorosa of nations. And I'm going to be sharing with you some quotes from Système de la Méditerranée because I want to give you a taste of the lyrical quality of his writings, although lyrical and hypnotic sometimes. And what? Is it not sufficient that generous France suffered on its own the cataclysm of a terrible revolution? Is it not enough that it received the baptism of fire and audaciously plunged itself in the ensuing bloodbath? Why, dear God, should not its merits and its accomplishments be to the benefit of all humanity? France drank the revolutionary chalice. It swallowed it in one swig. France climbed on the cross. France has been the Christ of nations. It purchased the world's peace and progress with its treasures, its sorrows, and the lives of its sons strewn on every battlefield. Now, this passage clearly indicates that Chevalier is not abdicating his country's universal manifest destiny. He's rather proposing the means to magnify and propagate its virtues, not by revolution and war, but through industrial association. In fact, he criticizes the prevailing opinion among his countrymen that the principles of emancipation can only be spread across Europe in the wake of French armies. We believe that in order to penetrate, progress had to engrave its passport into a cannonball. For him, the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars had shown the futility in trying to change the nature of a people by defeating and occupying it. So why continue to resort to artillery shells when railways and telegraph lines can be vectors for the peaceful enlightenment and emancipation of human societies? And we come across many of these passages that make the connection between technological innovation, railways, contacts, economic revolutions, and eventually a moral transformation. And this passage also includes a very clear definition of modernity as Chevalier understood it, right? The same unity, the same instantaneity. As the historical custodian of the ideals of liberty, equality, and freedom, France held the leading role in this new chapter in human history. Of all nations, France was best suited to serve as pacifier of the world, and as such, it was ordained by destiny to extend its hand to all peoples and prepare them to join the parade of civilized nations. And here, it's a long quote, but it's worth repeating. The pacifier will welcome all. To all peoples, classes, and individuals he will assign, according to their particular vocation, a distinct place, a distinct assignment in the common oeuvre. He will make grow every individuality, race, people, class, or man, according to its proper laws, by teaching it to rely on all and to help all, by connecting it to all. Through the pacifier, the entire world, led in procession through the pomp of industry, the brilliance of science, and the pleasures of the arts, will gravitate towards universal association. I say the entire world because it is not a question of including in our most immediate plans for pacification only the peoples who were once part of the European Catholic collective. It is not only the members of this outdated Christianity that we propose to reconcile and associate. And as this last sentence suggests, any prospect for perpetual peace in Europe lacked practicality so long as it did not rest on the reconciliation of the Orient and the Occident. Indeed, the lion's share of the Système de la Méditerranée is devoted to extolling the rewards to be gained by reconciling the two civilizations that have been in conflict for 30 centuries, from the Trojan War to the recent naval engagement at Navarino. For Chevalier, the millennial war between Islam and Christianity, with the Mediterranean as its main battleground, has been the most devastating, the most colossal, the most sweeping, and the most deeply rooted. Other European conflicts, as far as he's concerned, are internecine squabbles, mere domestic tussles. And so the second movement in the Système de la Méditerranée orchestrates the material and the spiritual union of cross and crescent. First, through the usual medium of railways, steamships, and telegraph cables, and then by reawakening and reassigning the productive capacities of the slumbering Orient. In the words of Chevalier, the consummation of this intimate communion between the divided peoples of the Mediterranean will be the first step towards universal association. And he offers the following three propositions as the basis for his Pax Mediterranea. First, the clash between Orient and Occident is not a religious contest. It is due rather to the conflicting dualism between spirit and matter. When the Arabs turned away from rationalism and from science, they inhibited their technical and material development. Their ensuing overcommitment to spirituality retarded their historical progress. The Orient fell into a deep, unworldly torpor. Its ruling classes became complacent, its peoples downtrodden. Now, these are Chevalier's words, but they come straight out of his mentor and guru, Prosper Enfantin, and the representation of the conflict between Orient and Occident as the manifestation of disequilibrium between spirit and matter was an article of faith for the followers of Prosper Enfantin. And here's a very interesting painting of Enfantin, and I'm going to zoom in on the detail to show you the books that are to his left. You have Saint-Simon's collected works with the Quran and the Bible. Yes, I tried twisting it, but I didn't want to. Sorry, Joe. So for Enfantin, the hallmark of the age of industry will be its resolution of all opposing dichotomies, or as he described it, now I'm quoting Enfantin, not Chevalier. The time of conflicting dualisms is over. Now is the age for the unceasing progress of harmony between flesh and spirit, between industry and science, between Orient and Occident, between woman and man. So Chevalier's second proposition is that the cultural differences between Orient and Occident must be respected until they melt away in the heat of universal association. He understands these differences as complementary and therefore as indispensable for the regeneration of the Orient through its association with the Occident. The universal association of the Saint-Simonians, it bears repeating, is predicated on the coexistence of asynchronic civilizations, and it's made possible by the unique capacity of Europe's modernity to harness morally dissimilar societies at different stages of development to the march of its own totalizing historical progress. And accordingly, Chevalier embraces the cultural differences of the Orient, but these must correspond to industry's imperative need for essentialized aptitudes, as summarized in the Saint-Simonian motto, to each according to one's capacity. A project founded on the annihilation, the expulsion, the extermination, or the ruin of certain peoples or certain classes within each population is a backwards plan. Every people, every class has its own genius, its own particular destiny. The humanitarian task is at once one and multiple. All peoples are members of humanity, and humanity won't be happy until all its members are free, until every people occupies in the workshop, in the laboratory, in the temple, the place that nature assigns it. Which brings me to the third and final proposition, which is that connectivity and circulation, specifically the circulation of men and machines, will drag the Orient out of its moral lethargy. Indeed, for Chevalier, it is the immobile fanaticism of the Muslims that is the true heresy. But Europe's penetration of the Orient, by land and by sea, will carry into its heart the scientific inventions and ideas of progress to reawaken its drowsy societies. And just as the lower classes of French society were perfectible through their association with the nation's industrial elite, so too were the static cultures of the southern Mediterranean to be redeemed through contact with the technological and dynamic societies of the northern rim. And the hyphen, or in this case, to use the much more appropriate French term, the trait d'union, in the Oriental-Occidental Association is the Mediterranean Sea, which is destined to become, in the words of Chevalier, the nuptial bed for Oriental and Occidental intercourse. And I apologize if you thought that this talk was going to be more racy, but it's all about railways in the end, right? So, anyway, by way of conclusion, I will emphasize that for all its professed pacifism and anti-militarism, we have in the Système de la Méditerranée compelling arguments for an expansive civilizing mission under the dual stimulus of European industrialism and Saint-Simonian notions of modernization. Eventually, the two commitments would come together overseas in North Africa. And this is an important angle that's often overlooked in the history of early French Algeria. And this is why Karl Marx's description of Saint-Simonism as utopian socialism is not only typically arrogant, but also fundamentally mistaken. Saint-Simonians did not merely talk the talk, they also walked the walk. And they had and when they walked the walk, they had very clear and devastating practical implications for Algerian Muslims between 1847 and 1870. With Enfantin's disciples at the helm of the native administration in Algeria by the late 1840s, the indigenous populations were increasingly governed as the colonial foil to the proletariat of France. And the same Saint-Simonian high modernist schemes that were to obviate class conflict at home were also expected to pacify and rationalize the archaic economies and primitive impulses of the North Africans. Thank you very much.
So in keeping with our format today, we have about 10 minutes for questions for Osama Abi-Mershed. So I will help to field the questions on your behalf. So questions?
I have a question. Yes. I may. Thank you very much, Osama. I was wondering if some of these Saint-Simonian ideas applied differently in Algeria versus Egypt versus anywhere else.
Yeah.
This is my question,
Okay.
essentially.
Right, absolutely, because what you have is different branches. I tried to show that early in one of the visuals. You have very different branches of Saint-Simonism, and the branch that was particularly active in Algeria was really the Enfantinist branch, with very clear ideas of what, the role that spirit and matter play. The Saint-Simonians who were in Egypt were part of the Enfantin, or at least Enfantin was part of that circle, but there's a clear cleavage at some point, and they go in different directions. Chevalier himself will eventually renounce Prosper Enfantin and follow a different branch of Saint-Simonism because he thinks Enfantin is turning this movement into a religion of appearances rather than, so yes, long answer to your question. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, please.
This is not a book. These are collection of essays written between January and I think March of 1832. Most of them were authored by Chevalier. The Système de la Méditerranée was authored entirely by Chevalier, and that's 4 articles. There's other articles that deal with industry and with the new political order and the Saint-Simonian religion, as they called it, that are authored by Chevalier, but by other Saint-Simonians as well.
Okay, so was this written as a direct response to the French invasion of Algeria, or that's just a coincidence?
It's a coincidence because the Enfantinistes are not present in Algeria yet, but it's written as a direct response to the July 1830 revolution, which not only scared the conservative element within the Saint-Simonians, but also promised to return the old structures of power after revolution, like monarchy. I mean, a lot of them were monarchists, but they wanted to see, they didn't want to see the old land tenured elite return. They didn't want to see the old clergy.
Right.
They wanted technocrats in power. And so it's mostly a reaction to what was happening in Paris.
I see.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yes.
So we have a question. Okay. Oh.
What would the contribution of the Orient be in this marriage? Is there anything in their writing about that?
Yes, I had to cut the paper short, but if you look at, and here's the interesting thing about Algeria is you don't necessarily need to rely simply on what they were saying, but you can actually have policy to study and examine and see how the discourse of the Saint-Simonians is translated into a program of action. Taking the creed that there's a politics of aptitude, that each race, or as they call it, each people, they don't want to use the term race yet, but every race has essentialist attributes. The European is entrepreneurial, rational, scientific. The Occident, the Orient is spiritual, is artisanal, is hardworking labor. And so they see this as the complement, right, to the entrepreneurship of Europe. And when they go into Algeria, you will see that they are going to implement policies in all sorts of realms, the legal, the educational, land tenure, even notions of citizenship, where you will have this divide, or not divide, but this dual approach to the essential nature of the European versus the essential nature of the Arab. And just to give you a very brief description, like in the 1860s, when they start creating this project called the Arab Kingdom, they're going to create a geographic space that's exclusive for the Arab way of life, which includes pastoralism, working on the creating agriculture, providing the European coastline with its raw materials, whereas the European cities will be its own restricted sphere, and there you will have industry, railways, modernity, etc. And even at the level of architecture, they preserved the Kasbah of Algiers because they felt they needed to show how modern the European quarters were. And you can't do that if you raise the Kasbah of Algiers. If you don't have this typical Arab city, then what's the use of having this nice, shiny European neighborhood? And they're going to have the same. They're going to have the same ideology in their approach to the renovation of Paris in the 1860s with Haussmann, who's a Saint-Simonian, by the way. All right, he's going to wipe out some of the popular îlots insalubres, right? These islands of what is insalubre? Unhealthy, right? You know. But at the same time, they're going to create areas where you need to maintain some kind of popular culture, like Les Halles, right, where we can come and sell the products of the countryside and these kinds of things. But at the same time, they're going to create a very modern city. Sorry, another long answer to the question.
Julia?
I've just thought about Michel Chevalier as sort of the Jean Monnet of, in a sense, but he's a century and a half or more, or less, maybe too early. But I wanted to know how these ideas relate to de Tocqueville, and how Chevalier and his cohort, how they deal with issues of colonial violence, because de Tocqueville, while also harshly criticizing the colonial regime in Algeria, made some very strange remarks saying, once we have committed the first violence, then he says, then you must go on to create other violences, and as a necessity, because once, so I just wondered how violence enters into this scheme of things.
Okay. Chevalier is often credited with being the architect of the European Union back in 1832. Right? The whole idea of a federated European Union starts with, so there's a connection there. It's not just intuition, they mention that. I mean, the second question is about Tocqueville, and it takes me back to something that Illham asked. One of the things that differentiates Saint-Simonism in Algeria is that eventually it's going to be taken over by military officers, military Saint-Simonians. Right? And their idea is, it's a very paternal approach to Arab society in the sense that violence has a role to play because you're dealing with children that need to be disciplined. De Tocqueville comes into contact with several of the most prominent Saint-Simonian military officers in Algiers in the 1840s when he's touring Algeria and decrying the state of native society. He comes into contact with probably the most intelligent polytechnicien Saint-Simonian officer there, de la Mauricière, right? And he has this interview, and they have dinner together, and at the end of it, de Tocqueville comes out having a double opinion about this fellow, who he finds is extremely, who's the only fellow he met in Algeria who understands what it takes to administer the Arabs, in the sense that he's talking about association rather than extermination. But at the same time, he sees him as someone who is just very violent in the way he's talking about his experiences in Algeria. So he's, on the one hand, he finds him appealing, but he's also finding him very abhorrent, right? And this is kind of where de Tocqueville is, right? When he starts describing conditions in Algeria and he compares them to conditions in the United States, for example, where he's decrying racism, he doesn't quite see colonialism as a similar system, as a racial system, right? He sees that, he sees himself as a liberal, and therefore clearly not a Saint-Simonian, their intention, but he also sees that he sees that the civilizing mission there, even though it slips into excess sometimes, is an overall good. And violence is there to maintain the colonized in this partnership, in this association of the civilizing mission, whether they like it or not, because they don't know what's best. So he meets several generals, and he finds them repulsive because of their atrocities, but at the same time, he doesn't condemn the entire system. He kind of condemns the excesses here or there. And that's one of the reasons I call him a liberal, because that tends to be kind of the liberal view of colonialism, right? That you tinker with it here and there, but overall the system is good, right?
Thank you. So, yes, please. Yeah, one more.
I'd like to say something out of my own experience with what was going on in the mid-40s, late 40s, and after that in the around 50, 52. The Saint-Simonians were not yet present in the European movement as such. But
are we talking about 1850s?
By,
Are we talking about
no,
1850s?
19. I'm speaking of 19
Okay.
before the Algerian macabre things started happening, and really Saint-Simonian had become so completely compromised there, at least in my point of view. By 1948, 49, and 50, the European movement started with France in the leadership, and of course the Saint-Simonian rhetoric was all part of it. I still remember between 1948 and 1950 or 51, the first meetings that we had. I say we because the youth of Europe had been organized as background to many of these events. And they took us to the Rhineland all along, and between for the speeches between Belgium and France, and then people like Schumacher and Adenauer were then coming up as an original thought makers. That was a Saint-Simonianism untouched yet, but what was about to happen in Algeria. So the European movement of a union started on a positive, optimistic, but very strongly Saint-Simonian rhetoric in those years. What happened in Algeria was still coming, and it was, of course, putting the entire equation of Saint-Simonian ideological presence in the formation of United Europe in a completely different light. This is just an observation.
I agree with you. I think that by then it was no longer the colonial context, but quite the opposite. How to decolonize and extract, how could France extract itself from Algeria? In fact, focus on European integration as France pulls out from its empire. Cooperation with Germany becomes the foreign policy.
Indeed, but without this Saint-Simonian benign rhetoric.
Well, if you reduce Saint-Simonianism to the high modernist ideology, then we could say we're all Saint-Simonians.
Thanks. So we're going to have to move on to our next speaker now. Our next speaker is Illham Khuri-Makdisi from Northeastern University.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much. Thank you first and foremost to Osama for organizing this and for including me. Thank you to all of the participants who've given wonderful papers, which always makes me want to be an early modernist, actually. But so I'm going to start in 1898. In 1898, Pietro Vasai, a 32-year-old Italian anarchist, disembarked in Alexandria after having roamed the Mediterranean for almost 3 years. Born and raised in Florence, Vasai had joined the very dynamic Tuscan anarchist scene at 16, quickly becoming one of its most active figures. He was a constant presence in anarchist and socialist circles and managed one of the most important anarchist periodicals of the time, like Questioni Sociali, that had been founded by Enrico Malatesta, the towering figure of Italian anarchism. The last decade of the 19th century was a time of serious repressions and crackdowns on anarchists throughout Europe. From the late 1880s until the late 1890s, Vasai's life followed a predictable pattern: anarchist activism, usually in the form of publishing, labor organization, and propaganda work among workers, followed by prison sentences triggering short periods of self-imposed exile, then a return to Italy, and another arrest and prison term. His flights took him to Switzerland, Tunisia, Barcelona, and perhaps beyond, places where he maintained a dynamic engagement with local anarchist activities. He soon established a wide web of contacts with fellow, mostly Italian anarchists throughout the world, gaining tremendous respect and making it into the who's who of anarchists, as well as gaining the dubious honor of being classified as dangerous anarchist, sovversivo or anarchico pericoloso, in Italian police files. He also acquired valuable experience in labor organization and propaganda. Around 1896, after being condemned to yet another round in prison, Vasai appealed for a conditional exoneration, a legal device through which subversives were pardoned by the Italian state on condition that they left the country and relocated elsewhere, and obtained the right to exile himself to Egypt. He eventually made his way to Alexandria, where he would remain until 1914. Fin de siècle Alexandria, where Vasai disembarked, was no virgin territory for anarchists. Wittingly or unwittingly, the Ottoman Empire in general, and Egypt specifically, had been harboring European revolutionaries probably since the 1820s, offering asylum to Italian Carbonari as well as participants in the 1848 revolutionaries fleeing repression from Europe. In the 1870s, Italian anarchists began heading there for a number of reasons. For some of them, the Ottoman Empire epitomized tyranny and oppression, and a revolution there would lead to its ineluctable destruction and subsequent replacement, in the words of one prominent anarchist, by, and I'm quoting, a Republican federation of the Balkan provinces with Constantinople as a free city, end of quote. A number of anarchists participated in the liberation struggles of various Ottoman provinces, most notably in Crete in 1866 and 1896, in the hopes of bringing forth the destruction of this tyrannical entity. While most anarchists did not hold such beliefs, or were not willing to risk their lives for them, many were deeply interested in the Eastern question and wrote about it. More importantly for our story, beginning in the 1870s, Egypt, deemed more liberal than the rest of the Ottoman Empire, became a chosen destination for Italian and other anarchists. By then, the Egyptian cities were well plugged into global information and communications networks, and news from all over the world reached them promptly, thanks to the telegraph, news agencies, a reliable postal system, and a plethora of periodicals. Furthermore, people and commodities flocked there with ease and regularity, as the Suez Canal, a fairly extensive railway system, and steamships connected Alexandria to the rest of the world, and most notably to Italy. For the internationalist, highly mobile, and often on-the-run anarchists, access to this kind of infrastructure was vital. By April 1876, anarchist activity in Alexandria was such that there existed an operating branch of the International Workers' Association. A year later, this section of the International proclaimed its adhesion to the Universal Socialist Congress of Ghent and Belgium and sent a representative there. Although the line between socialism and anarchism was becoming more rigidly demarcated in Europe around the time, there clearly still was some degree of collaboration. Significantly, the Alexandrian branch seems to have asked the Universalist Socialist Congress to establish a federal office to propagate socialism in Oriental regions through the publications of works in Italian, Greek, Turkish, and Arabic. That same year, the first Italian anarchist periodical to be published outside of Italy came out in Alexandria, entitled Il Lavoratore, thus signaling the strength of the Italian network in Egypt and its pioneering role within the Italian diasporic anarchist world. The city was deemed important enough to attract two of the most iconic figures of Italian anarchism, Enrico Malatesta, whom I've mentioned, and Amilcare Cipriani. Italian anarchists led by Malatesta are even said to have fought on the side of Arabi and against the British in 1882. When the British occupied Egypt that year, some of them were arrested while others fled. While Malatesta and Cipriani were the big stars who converged on Alexandria, the motor behind the city's anarchist community was a more modest figure, Ugo Parini, who had settled there in the late 1870s. Parini set himself the task of reorganizing the anarchist movement and unifying its various splinter groups. He organized anarchist meetings, including the one in 1881 that was attended by 100 anarchists. He also founded a clandestine printing press in Alexandria that lasted around 1882, and which the anarchists used to print manifestos, periodicals, and booklets, such as the one celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Paris Commune. Parini also founded the Circolo Europeo di Studi Sociali, a study group open to all those who wish to study the social question, or so it was advertised. After briefly fleeing or being forcibly expelled during the British occupation, he returned to Egypt. Not much is known about Parini's or other anarchist activities in the city in the 1890s, but by March 1892, they were again numerically significant enough to organize at least one public demonstration with speeches and chants in the ethnically mixed working-class neighborhood of Muharrem Bey. During this demonstration, one of Bakunin, one of the most iconic and important anarchists, one of Bakunin's manifestos was printed and plastered all over town. The city remained a magnet for Italian anarchists well into the 20th century for various practical and legal reasons. Starting in 1898, virtually every European state, a number of Northern and Southern American states, as well as the Ottoman Empire, decided to broach the threat of anarchism in a concerted manner and combine their efforts in crushing subversives and fighting terrorism. The expansion of international law for this aim and the establishment of mechanisms allowing police cooperation across the boundaries of national jurisdictions probably set the basis for our modern-day Interpol. Britain, however, refused to participate in the establishment of an international police system in charge of tracking down anarchists. It was actually the sole dissenter from among the 21 countries that met in Rome in 1898. Another set of agreements known as the Secret Protocol for the International War on Anarchism was signed in St. Petersburg in 1904, but again, Britain opted out. This is not to say that anarchists had it easy in Egypt, but it probably still meant they weren't as often arrested there, for instance, as in Italy or France. More so, Egypt's own multiple and rather convoluted legal system, mixed versus indigenous courts, further complicated matters, often allowing European anarchists to maneuver around the system and play one legal system against another, thus gaining time and postponing the workings of justice. This relative leniency nonetheless did not eliminate the threat of occasional crackdowns, raids, and trials that involved anarchists or people suspected of anarchist sympathies. If anarchists were in theory at least more tolerated in Egypt than elsewhere, they were subjected to relentless surveillance, as the British archives and the bulky file on suspected anarchists compiled by the Italian consulate in Egypt eloquently testify. A report dating from 1900 suggests that suspected active anarchists in Egypt numbered around 66, most of whom were employed as masons, carpenters, shop owners, and workers. A handful of them were classified as dangerous. Nonetheless, Italian anarchists did not only head to Alexandria in order to be relatively safe from police hassle and surrounded by friendly anarchists. They were attracted there by the presence of a significant Italian working class, the natural audience for anarchist propaganda efforts. In the late 19th century and continuing well into the 20th, Italians, as well as Greeks, Maltese, Syrians, Armenians, and Jews from the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy, formed networks of labor that circulated throughout the Mediterranean in search of employment. In this geography of migration, few countries attracted Mediterranean workers as much as Egypt. A modernizing state with a booming construction industry, including railways, port expansion, and the famous Suez Canal, developing factories, and a spectacular growth in trade, Egypt was to play the role of a Mediterranean El Dorado, and its two main cities, Cairo and especially Alexandria, constituted sites of convergence for various Mediterranean labor networks for many decades and well into the 20th century. By the turn of the century, around 12,000 Italians lived in Alexandria out of a population of over 300,000, although many industries had as much as 20% of their workshop Italian. The overwhelming majority were workers, and they were employed primarily in the construction industry as carpenters, masons, stone carvers, and painters, as well as in crafts. Many also worked as cooks, servants, shopkeepers, wine distributors, shoemakers, and tailors, while women found jobs as seamstresses, servants, and nannies. A significant proportion seems to have been seasonally employed, or was in Egypt for years before moving elsewhere, to other parts of North Africa, most prominently Tunisia, the Ottoman Empire, the Americas, or to Italy. Employment was often volatile and could come to a sudden end, as large construction projects were abandoned halfway for lack of funding, or simply terminated without prior notice. Many migrant workers were in fact prospective workers who had no guarantee of being employed. While many Italians left Italy and headed south and east, lured by the possibilities of recruitment by railway or port companies and convinced they would easily be recruited, they were often disappointed. In the late 1890s and for the following 25 years, Italian consuls in various Mediterranean cities deplored their compatriots' rush south and did their best to dissuade workers from heading to Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria in search of employment and these large infrastructural projects. One report sent in 1896 by the Italian consul in Alexandria warned of the high numbers of Italian workers who converged there only to find themselves unemployed and on the streets, and prompted the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to, quote, invite our workers to abstain, at least for now, from trying to find work in Egypt, end of quote. Time and again, similar grim warnings were sent from Italian consuls around the Eastern Mediterranean, reminding prospective immigrants of the fate of their compatriots who had ventured east only to remain unemployed, quote, leading a life of laziness or having to contend with miserable salaries, end of quote. The frantic reports written by Italian and other consuls throughout the southern and eastern Mediterranean indicate that the potential for labor subversion and radical militancy among a roaming, migrant, and often unemployed labor force was not lost on local observers. In fact, it's highly likely that the relationship between transience and unemployment on one hand, and on the other potential trouble in the form of labor militancy, was not a mere figment of consular imagination. A number of studies on workers corroborate this real and imagined association between migration and subversion, not only in Egypt and around the Mediterranean, but throughout the world. In the late 19th and 20th century, perhaps no group of migrants was as effectively engaged in migrating globally and spreading radical and specifically anarchist ideas as Italian workers, who probably, in the words of one historian, came closest to being an international revolutionary proletariat than any other group of workers. In Alexandria, police surveillance does not seem to have seriously deterred anarchists from their tasks at hand. Throughout the 1890s and 1900s, Vasai, Parini, and their companions relentlessly busied themselves doing propaganda work among workers, mostly but not exclusively Italian. One of their main aims and accomplishments was to move beyond existing mutual aid societies, deemed not political enough by anarchist standards, and establish what was known as leagues of resistance. These leagues were units that helped workers stand up to their employers, strike, and negotiate. Part of their raison d'etre was to establish common funds to help strikers survive without yielding to the financial pressure of having to break a strike and go back to work. Being himself a typographer, Vasai began his organizational work among fellow typographers and was crucial to the establishment of the Typographers League, whose members seem to have remained at the forefront of anarchist activities. He also seems to have been quite successful working with other workers. In 1902, 3 different leagues, that of cigarette rollers, construction workers, and typographers, joined forces and started holding common meetings. Vasai was also instrumental in founding leagues of resistance in Cairo, and his opinion and expertise were often called upon by his anarchist companions based in the capital. He and his companion participated in organizing strikes, going as far as publishing the names of picket crossers and strike breakers on the pages of the periodicals they founded. They also fundraised for workers' widows and sick workers' families, and helped widows negotiate financial compensation from their deceased husbands' employers. Another important anarchist activity was publishing. At least 7 anarchist periodicals were issued in Alexandria between 1877 and 1914. Vasai in particular put his typographer's skill to good use and produced at least 1 extant periodical with Joseph Rosenthal, a Russian Jewish anarchist with a Beiruti connection who settled in Alexandria in 1899. La Tribune Libre, or La Tribuna Libera, which was bilingual, had a publication figure that hovered around 1,000, of which 600 copies were sent to Italy. It published translations of texts by all the big authors and thinkers of anarchism, Kropotkin, Alexander Bakunin, Élisée Reclus, and Leo Tolstoy, as well as by articles by Italian anarchists such as Enrico Malatesta. It also devoted a section on local matters, discussing local anarchist initiatives such as talks, meetings, and strikes. Among Vasai, Perini, and their companions' prime concern was to plug even more firmly, Alexandria and Egypt into the global and specifically Italian network that constituted the world anarchist scene, and that spanned various parts of the Mediterranean and Europe, Italy, and the Americas, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, as well as the United States. Indeed, as I mentioned, not only were these periodicals distributed locally, they were also sent abroad to fellow anarchists in Naples, Buenos Aires, Paterson, New Jersey, and probably elsewhere. Members of the Egyptian anarchist scene also contributed articles and entries on the condition of anarchism in Egypt to anarchist periodicals in the above-mentioned places, and engaged in discussions with fellow anarchists on the pages of famous anarchist periodicals, such as Jean Grave's influential La Révolte. They followed each other's news closely and with concern, worried about their companions' fate, sent news about individual anarchists and their itineraries, fundraised internationally to support anarchist families abroad, subsidized anarchist periodicals in Italy or abroad, and passionately debated various anarchist theories. The periodicals were central to the establishment and maintenance of this global community and sense of solidarity, a feeling that was also cultivated by the constant circulation and visits of members of this network, who carried with them letters, news, books, and periodicals from fellow anarchists. Perhaps most remarkably, Alexandria's anarchists were the motor behind the establishment of the Université Populaire Libre, which lasted over a decade. I can talk more about this during the Q&A. Basically, it's an institution where some of the anarchist texts were discussed, were taught, and that sought to reach out to the popular classes of the city. And they also offered courses as to how to negotiate, for workers to negotiate with their bosses. So this brings me to the vexed notion of impact. How can we assess this Italian network's impact on Italian working classes in Alexandria, let alone on Alexandria's workers or even Egyptian society generally? Although the number of workers who attended the anarchist meetings and joined the leagues was not massive, it was not negligible, with figures between 80 and 200 for attendance and membership in various leagues. Occasionally, consular reports mention a huge crowd attending a talk given by one anarchist or another. Obviously, success and impact are relative, and different sources paint a different picture. For instance, Italian consular reports from 1902, perhaps as wishful thinking, suggested that there was no need to worry too much about the study groups that Vasai and others established, because like previous attempts, they were doomed to fail. On the other hand, the memoirs of Pea, Enrico Pea, famous Italian author, and certain autobiographical essays by Giuseppe Ungaretti, even more famous Italian poet, who were all members of this anarchist movement in Alexandria, as well as some of the extant periodicals themselves, suggest that anarchists were getting their messages across, despite various hurdles, rivalries, and tensions. More so, while it is true that many of the anarchist periodicals were short-lived, there were many of them, thus guaranteeing a constant flow of anarchist information and propaganda. I should also quickly mention that many of their publications were multilingual, and we can talk about the issue of language also during the Q&A. More so, various signs indicated that Italian anarchists were reaching out or having contact with local Egyptian, indigenous, or immigrants. One of these kinds of activities was the distribution throughout the city of multilingual anarchist and socialist tracts. One such example was a tract protesting against a department store's mistreating of its workers, which was published by a society called La Société Internationale des Employés du Caire in French, Greek, and Arabic. Records also indicate that the multi-ethnic and multilingual Cairene Typographers League, which was heavily infiltrated by anarchists, had pledged its support to the League of Indigenous Typographers in their efforts to unionize, and considered their indigenous colleagues to be serious about labor militancy. I'm going to skip since I have 2 more minutes. The historian Bettini, who wrote quite a lot on Italian anarchists all over the world, writing in the 1970s, argued that the Italian anarchists had failed to penetrate Egyptian local working milieu, which he linked to their inability to come up with a kind of political intervention that was adequate to the existing cultural and political scene. Specifically, Bettini argued that rather than adapt their discourse and their action to suit local indigenous needs, Italian anarchists had promoted a model that really suited European working classes in Europe. In fact, and quite tellingly, the Egyptian-Italian anarchist community appears to have been split on the issue of including and reaching out to non-Italians, specifically indigenous. Perhaps the reasons for excluding non-Italians were a combination of racism and stereotypes, to which anarchists were not immune, and the fear that other groups of workers, and especially indigenous ones, would be willing to take the jobs of striking workers. In other words, that they had no class solidarity, to use the terminology. Versailles, at least, seems to have been favorable to collaborating with and doing propaganda work among non-Italian workers. He collaborated with Rosenthal, and a few sources suggested that one of the leagues he founded included indigenous Egyptians, as well as Italian and other immigrant workers. More generally, the examples provided in this paper on multilingual publications, talks, and collaborations between Italians and non-Italians all suggest that the Italian anarchist ideas and praxis were in fact not confined to Italian workers. I will skip and just perhaps just read the conclusion, and then perhaps we can discuss a few of the points during Q&A. So the story of Italian anarchism in Alexandria sheds light on important features of the city itself and of the Eastern Mediterranean generally. First, it shows that Alexandria, and perhaps to a slightly less extent, Cairo, was very much integrated into the global world, and that rather than have a history that was separate, utterly distinctive, followed a different cadence, or was isolated from world trends, the city was in fact a central player and participant in the story of radicalism and globalization, and specifically of global resistance to global capital. Alexandria's anarchist story is somewhat comparable to that of Rio de Janeiro, for instance, or of Paterson, New Jersey. The major differences and important differences being an issue of scale. It is a story that also confirms the existence of a geography of contestation connecting certain cities through radical networks, and more specifically establishing radical trajectories along and across the Mediterranean as well as beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Illham. So just close it? Okay. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Yes, Elliot.
Yeah, my question, I love this story you're telling, and as you know, anarchists in Cairo just 2 weeks ago requested your book from me, and they were very happy to get it in their hands because they're interested in this history. The question I have for you, one has to do with I guess they both have to do with the end point of the history, and I'm wondering if you could just spin the story out in 2 different directions. One is, to what extent do the anarchists effectively respond to Italian colonial efforts nearby? And the second question has to do with maybe a little bit later, but the rise of fascism, which if I understand the history of the Italians in Alexandria, the rise of fascism within that community had its own sort of long-term effects and contributes to the demise of the Italians in Alexandria.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Great questions. The end of the story, I will say that World War I definitely changes things. It's a watershed, partly generally because the left loses a lot of its credibility because so many people actually are for the war, right? And because the left is incapable of actually preventing the war. The anarchists had been consistent all along as being very staunchly anti-militaristic, and they remained that way. But a lot of the changes that occurred as a consequence of World War I, specifically the Bolshevik Revolution and then the emergence of more organized political parties, including in the Arab world, the socialist and then the communist parties, certainly affected the anarchist activism and activities in Egypt. But what's important to note is that a few of these figures, most prominently Joseph Rosenthal, whom I mentioned here, who is a very convinced anarchist and before 1914, remains an anarchist, but he reinvents himself as a communist, and he's one of the founders of the Egyptian Communist Party, right? So there are certain continuities, in fact, between the pre-World War I and the post-World War I story of the left specifically. About these anarchists' response to Italian colonialism, anarchists are actually quite consistent about condemning colonialism, and they condemn them unlike socialists who very often are more liberal in the sense that for the socialists, they do not necessarily condemn the entire system, to go back to the point that Osama was making for the Saint-Simonian, but they condemn its application and they believe in reforming perhaps certain aspects. And certainly a lot of the socialists, the Italian, but especially the French socialists, and certainly in Algeria and even Tunisia before World War I, are sympathetic to colonialism in a lot of ways that anarchists in Egypt are not, actually. So I would say that they're quite consistent in condemning colonialism. Before 1911, it's easy for them to condemn colonialism because the Italians are not as involved as the French are. But even during the Libyan episode in 1911, they do quite systematically condemn colonialism as a structure, ultimately. The rise of fascism, some of these figures end up becoming attracted to fascism, actually, Enrico Pea being one of the most famous ones. But he becomes attracted to fascism after he moves to Italy. So that's part of a longer story. I don't know enough about the Alexandrian scene in the 20s and the 30s specifically, but I know that it splits along these lines of fascists and anti-fascists. But I know that there remained a very important group of Italian militants who were deeply anti-fascistic and were working in this realm in Egypt and in other parts of North Africa. I should also say about North Africa, as I'm sure all of you know, that the rise of fascism in Spain also plays a very important role. And you have significant numbers of Spanish anti-fascists, Republicans, anarchists, communists, but a lot of anarchists who actually flee from Spain and settle in North Africa, right? So that story continues also from the Spanish perspective.
So other questions? And I apologize if I don't see you right away. There's a bit of a glare. Yeah.
I can't see anything.
Thank you. Thank you, Illham. I have a question. I've been interested for a while on the European converts to Sufism in Egypt, and some of them wrote articles in Italian magazines in Egypt. Can you elaborate with that?
Yes, I'm very glad you mentioned this. I know of one case of a very famous woman, actually, Leda Raffanelli, who moved to Alexandria, lived there for a few years, and had two conversions, one of them to anarchism through this group that I talked about, and the other one to Islam. And she actually became a Sufi. She moved back to Italy, and she was very active in the anarchist milieu. And I don't know a lot more about her, but...
There was also a French called René something, I can't forget his name. Yeah, he also wrote in Italian.
Yes, René Chogui, he was in Algeria, no? Algeria or Tunisia, I'm blanking out now. Not Egypt, though.
No, this is someone who was in Egypt. I'm sure he was in Egypt. And later on moved to... Anyway, this is interesting that his conversion to Sufism and its relation with the anarchists, the Italian anarchists, writing and publishing in Italian magazines and newspapers published in Egypt. I found this really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it's an important connection, and it's one I haven't really worked on systematically. I mean, again, Leda Raffanelli is the most famous person to appear as somebody who's joining these two trends, or more than trends. But I'm sure there were many more besides her. Thank you.
So, other questions? Comments? Okay, we have a question right here. Yeah. And then one more back there.
Thank you. So that was wonderful. And I guess one thing I just wanted to point out is that one thing that your study and your previous book sort of help us to begin thinking about is the whole question of where is the Mediterranean and when is the Mediterranean, and for what purposes and how and so on. So it becomes much more sort of contextual, and this particular sort of wave of anarchist responses to what we could call the first globalization, or depending on when you want to start it, but the sort of the really big uptick in world trade that goes on from the 1870s on forward. And it's matched by a global movement, again, that we're just beginning to now learn about, of anarchists, in which the Italians are crucially important in the Mediterranean and the South American elements, to some extent also in the US. But now there's also work on people who later on end up mostly in either the Indian Communist Party or in Indian nationalism, who are themselves plausibly described as anarchists. And so Maya Ramnath has a book that in the UC Press World History series on that one. And there's another book forthcoming at Cambridge by a man named Alex Day, which is on East Asian anarchist currents. And so these are all sort of multi-spatial, and they're sort of movable feasts. They're in different places depending on when the police are after them or not, and where opportunities for work occur, and no doubt other elements as well. So how watertight are these compartments? And Russian ones too, surely, right? So, which in some ways sort of precedes all of this. So to what extent are these different anarchist currents in connection with one another? And here's the off-the-wall second question, which you can choose to disregard. But oftentimes, no doubt implausibly in many ways, comparison has been made between Al-Qaeda and the anarchists, right? So international terrorist organizations in a particular moment of a global boom, and we could go on and sketch in a few other elements. And do you see anything plausible about this comparison, or anything enlightening about it?
I refuse to see the analogy, although I can see why logistically the analogy can be made, right? Also, what's quite remarkable about the anarchists, and I guess Al-Qaeda is comparable, is that they managed to capitalize on new media very, very quickly. And they do this much more efficiently and much faster than anyone else. These periodicals, I've dwelled so much on them just because it's incredible just how many they produced and how much they managed to send them all over the world, and how you'd get reports on what's happening in Egypt and in newspapers in New Jersey and in South America, right? So really, information, capitalizing on the importance of information for organization is their forte. And I should add that anarchists are remarkable for us historians Because they've been persecuted and they've gone underground and their history has been obliterated, they themselves have been obsessed with the idea of trying to maintain some kind of records, all of their activities. And so they've come up with biographical dictionaries about anarchists all over the world, earlier than anyone else has done this kind of thing. And they've posted a lot of the information on the web and in very intelligent internet sources very early on. So from that perspective, yes, I can see the analogy. At the same time, I cannot but help emphasize the distinction and the kind of vision that they're proposing about the world. And also about how universalists, obviously, their ideology is, which is very universalist in one case and not terribly universalist in the other. So I think I leave it at that.
Thank you, Illham. So our next speaker is William Granara from Harvard University.
Good afternoon. I'll try to keep you awake this late day. I also would like to thank Osama and his colleagues for a wonderful reception, organizing and receiving us here today. It's always a great pleasure to come back to my alma mater. Julia and I were reminiscing about the good old days when helicopters hovered over the campus, spraying mace on anti-Vietnam demonstrators. The good old days, huh? I'd like to, my paper today is part of a longer project that goes much beyond me, but many people working in the field of Arabic literature, trying to rewrite the history and the story of Arabic literature. So part of my project is to look at early North African Arabic literature. And what I'd like to do is to show that this literature is as Mediterranean and is as Arabic. Please allow me also to dedicate my paper to the memory of my teacher and friend, Barbara Stovasser. This is the first time I've been to Georgetown, and she's not here, and her absence is very strong. This essay argues that modern Tunisian literature is at once Arabic and Mediterranean, Arabic in language and temperament, in literary heritage and influence, and in political stances. It's Mediterranean in historical consciousness, in geographical setting and outlook, and in its expansive aesthetic, ethnic, and cross-cultural boundaries. I focus on the literary works of Zine al-Abidine Sunusi, born 1899, died 1965, and his works penned between the years of the 30s and the 40s. And my primary strategy for reading these works is to establish a direct interface between them and between the French Pied Noir epic novel of Louis Bertrand, Le Son des Races, that was written and published around 1900. Both figures stood at the forefront of intellectual movements that defined the colonial era of North Africa. The Latinist movement of Bertrand was inspired as much by the wave of neoclassical architecture and ideology of the late 19th and early 20th century, as it was by the theories of Comte Gobineau on the white racial supremacy and European expansion. As a cultural force, it sought to situate and justify France's imperial project and civilizing mission within the continuum of Latin, read European, sovereignty that dates back to the Roman Empire. Sunusi's fictional works are embedded in the reality of colonized Tunisia. They are best read, but not solely read, as direct responses to French imperialism and its presumptuous cultural hegemony. His fiction draws from milestones of Mediterranean history, the rise and ascendancy of Islam, and from Arabic literary heritage, Turath, all combined to produce a master narrative that sets in relief Tunisia's existence as a Mediterranean civilization, fortified by the Arab conquest of North Africa, read as Islam's liberationist mission. Sunusi situates this conquest within a long historical continuum of Semitic, Eastern, and Arab settlements along the Mediterranean rim. I argue that all my proof texts, French and Arabic alike, are comparably grounded in their own contemporary political contexts as much as they are in the author's understanding, at once literal and mythical, of European and Islamic histories. My reading in juxtaposition of Bertrand and Sunusi carries with it, admittedly, a certain imbalance on both aesthetic and political fronts. Generically, Louis Bertrand's Son des Races, widely distributed and well-read throughout French North African colonies, is a 300-page epic novel that draws from a Western literary canon that was, by the time of its publication, multifaceted, fully matured, and popularly received. The Tunisian pieces, amounting to less than 100 pages in combination, are experimental, hybrid, and penned in an intermediate phase of generic development when North African Arab writers were still navigating their way through the complex of Western strictures and Arabic modes of creative writing, still dominated by the classical tradition. Politically and linguistically, Bertrand was writing from a position of power, literary and political power, at a time and place when French occupational governments maintained a firm control over most of the means of communication and print production in the areas they occupied. On the academic and critical fronts, one need only look at a contemporary literary history and anthology to see how French or Francophone literary production was privileged and deemed worthy of critical study, while its Arabic counterpart was restrained in what Ian Collar recently cited as, and I quote, the closely guarded bastions of academic Orientalism, end of quote. Senoussi wrote from behind the lines of defense, constantly subjected to both colonial and domestic censorship, as both Tunisian intellectuals found themselves wrestling, as most Tunisian intellectuals found themselves wrestling with the French authorities over licenses to print and publish. Here, as much as the literarity of these texts draws my attention, does their contribution to the political debates and national cultural formation processes that they subsumed. The imbalance in my interface may be more apparent in the fact that Bertrand's Latinist movement represents what may be labeled as the right-wing fashion of European Orient colonialism, while I see Senoussi representing the moderate humanist faction of reformist Islamic discourse and Arab nationalism. There were more to the left to Senoussi, by the way, and again, Arabic writing was ideologically very expansive. It wasn't monolithic. My justification rests, however, precisely on the oddly similar ways in which both writers use history to construct national identity, and on the centrality of the Mediterranean as indigenous homeland and legitimate historical space to which each author stakes his literary claim. I also argue that the pairing of these two nationalist-oriented literatures leads to further lines of inquiry in reading the Arab, Muslim, Eastern, and European, Christian, Western interconnectedness that continues to permeate modern Mediterranean literatures to this day. Additionally, I read these two authors within the long-standing battle between French and Arabic as the language of erudition, high culture, and popular national expression in North Africa from the colonial period until the present. The literatures of Senoussi and Bertrand, representing two histories in conflict, are consciously written in high registers of these imperial languages to attract and persuade the educated and literary masses to their causes. This is not to say that other languages and language registers did not exist within this contestation. Senoussi's choice of writing in modern standard Arabic must be viewed against other choices available to him at the time. Firstly, there was French itself, which was the language of choice of many young Algerian and Tunisian writers aspiring to careers as poets and writers of fiction. Francophone writing was often subversive, almost always critical, but in the end, a willing participant in the French civilizing mission. I'm going to hear it. Secondly, there was colloquial Arabic, disdained by the religious and cultural elites as a medium of written expression, which emerged nonetheless in popular stories and maqamat, songs, anthems, poetry, and theater, and which enjoyed widespread popular appeal. Thirdly, language such as Italian, or as Julie will remind us, Italians, Greek, Maltese, Spanish, and Ladino could be seen and heard particularly among the mixed neighborhoods of Pied Noir and other minority communities. And fourthly, there was the lingua franca of Franco-Arab, the playful mixture of European languages with Arabic, so derisively described by Bertrand as the, quote, the cacophony of languages and dialects that filled the ports, train stations, bathhouses, and marketplaces, and at times brazenly made their way into art forms. Sanusi's choice of Standard Arabic was a political one, given that the historical, cultural, and literary gravitas of classical Arabic was to him and his like-minded cohort the only weapon to use against the might of the French language. Finally, I read these texts and the affinities I see within them with an eye on the current debates in the contemporary cultural theories of postcoloniality and Mediterraneanism, with the former's, one, concern with place and displacement, two, the complexity and hybridity of generic forms and strategies, and three, the dialectic of self and other, indigène and exile, language and place, slave and free, the matrix of postcolonial literatures. Moreover, the recent debates on Mediterraneanism following the publication of Horton Purcell's Corrupting Sea, the depth and breadth of which span far beyond the contours of my essay, nevertheless proffers the idea of connectivity as a way of understanding the series of connection and fragmentation that replace the more traditional held view of a united monolithic Mediterranean basin. It is precisely this binary of connectedness and fragmentation that lies at the heart of the fictional cosmos of Sanusi, as well as other among his Tunisian cohort. For in their contestation of the French imperial project concerning Tunisia's place in the world, temporally and spatially, lurks the constant reminder that Tunisia, as Phoenician, Greek, Roman, Carthaginian, Byzantine, Muslim, Ottoman, and modern, has always been there alongside Europe, there and now. In contraposing these works, I consider three areas upon which to base my comparisons, and I've shaved most of my original paper from close readings of the text, so bear with me. I look at geography, race, and gender. By geography, I explore the physical borders and interior spaces of that delineate the world of the text. Assuming that the Mediterranean is situated at the center of a fictional cosmos and constructed as an area of contested space, what are its temporal and spatial circumferential points that give it its centrality? In considering race, I examine the peoples who populate the fictional cosmos, and I interrogate the text positions on human agency, identity, and essentialism that inform civilizational and political rivalries. Finally, by considering gender, we see how these texts deal with shifts from tradition to modernity that dominate much of early modern Mediterranean literature. Areas of agenda include notions of power, patriarchy, and sexuality, highly significant markers that allow us to decode political and social messages of the text. I'm especially interested in the contrast between the female characters of each author, given that the depiction of Muslim women, either traditionally veiled or Western garbed, was paramount in European colonial and indigenous reformist discourses. From national allegory to measurement for progress and assimilation, or the lack thereof, the Arab Muslim woman has enjoyed or suffered inordinate attention in the 1920s and the 1930s. Bertrand Sang de Race is an epic novel about Algeria's European settler community, the Pieds Noirs, at the turn of the century. In my original paper, I talk about it being the grandfather or the father of Albert Camus. Its map knows the two realms, the countries of the Western European Mediterranean, Spain, France, and Italy, and an Algeria denuded of linguistic, historic, religious, and cultural ties to the wider Arabo-Berber North Africa or to the Arab-Muslim East. The Algerian landscape includes both the urban and the rural. The city of Algiers is a bustling cosmopolitan, with thriving ports as receptacles to imported food, wine, and luxury goods from Europe. Depositories for a hybrid population of mixed peoples and races, speaking in a cacophony of languages and dialects. The oasis town of La Rouat, 200 miles south of Algiers, by contrast, is the military headquarters for the Sahara, the valorized as authentic homeland for Pieds Noirs Algeria. Its function as a starting point for European manifest destiny, expanding the frontiers of France's conquest far beyond the poorest, effeminate, and impure port cities in order to reclaim or reimagine an indigenous landscape of Rome of Roman Empire's African province. The Pieds Noirs settlers, the heroes of Bertrand Sand, brutal, masculine, and headstrong, explore and subdue the wide terrain in wagon trains and horse carriages that cut across the Algerian desert, pillaging its natural resources and whipping savage indigènes into submission and civilization. In 1999, there was a reprint of this novel. We have it at the Widener Library, but 6 months in all through Paris, I could not find a copy of the book. But in the reprint, you have pictures, paintings of Algerians on Conestoga wagons of such, whipping the savages trying to raid the wagon trains, and it looks exactly right out of the West, the Wild West in 19th century America. The Europe of Saint-Simonian cartography includes France, Spain, and Italy, ancestral lands to both the Pieds Noirs population and Roman imperial history. Highly significant in this mapping is a distinction between France, and more specifically Paris as metropole, and between Spain, i.e. between the political and cultural French elite who inhabit the cities and reap the fruits of conquest, and the Spaniards who man the docks, work the factories, till the soil, and traverse the desert. This binary of France and Spain defines most significantly the Europe of Algerian colonization. The France of les Saint-Simonians is constantly evoked by the force of political and cultural sovereignty, articulated through images of its institutions, language, refined manners, luxury goods, deftly played off against the rugged earthiness of the Pieds Noirs society. Spain, by contrast, is drawn in most graphically by the continuity of the extended family who migrate from Valencia to Algeria shortly after the establishment of the French protectorate in 1860. There's Raphael, his grandfather, is introduced by way of family anecdotes, while his father, Ramon, a powerful patriarch and the quintessence of the true colonial European spirit, dies early in the novel, leaving the son, Raphael, is the character. The mother is Rosa, by the way, and I have this instinct that the author chose the letter R as a powerful marker of pronunciation between Europe Francophone and French versus Francophone. So I think that there's something to that. Let's see what I can do here. I'm going to have to go off and go into Sanusi. Anyway, they go around, and women are all basically saloons, and there's the mother figure of Rosa, but all the other women are saloon girls and whores and things of that nature, right out of Gunsmoke and Kitty, Doc, and Chester, so to speak. Let me see if I can go. So thirdly, I talk about race. Race and nationality are also significant markers in the novel, and there's a constant divide. In Bertrand, for instance, the continental divide between Europeans and indigenous Algerians is reinforced with the stark polarization between Europeans and on the one hand, and Arab Berbers and Jewish Algerians on the other. So this is clearly marked. The three texts that I use of Sanusi are the following. The first is something called The Conquest of Africa, which he published as a novel when it's in fact a three one-act play, and it was staged in the beautiful Art Deco theater in downtown Tunisia. It narrates the story of an Arab general who visits the Byzantine warlord with an appeal to end his fractious rule and submit to the inevitable conquest of North Africa. So the first part of this particular story talks about the Arab conquest. It takes place in Siecle, which is right outside the city of Kairouan, and the action takes place between a very noble Arab prince, a commander, and his three interlocutors are the three women of the palace, in which he gives voice to women, which is a very stark contrast to the novel. To the particular play, and I'm going to go over that. Let me read here. The self-othering opposition is drawn on the surface along east-west lines, Greeks, Byzantine, Romans, and Vandals on one side, Arabs, Berbers, and Carthaginians on the other. The binary echoes Henri Perrin's Mohammedan Charlemagne, published a year before the opening of the play, which posits that the Islamic conquest and the rise of Carolingians broke with antiquity. Again, I'm trying to show that this Sanusi's work is interfacing with what's going on in the West. The second is a novel called Bint Qasr al-Jem. The novel is the result of Sanusi's time spent in a detention camp in Naples, where he heard the stories of a Libyan villager who was sent to Italy in prison for protesting against the Italian colonization. And he's weaving these stories of the Hilali, the Beni Halal. And let me just give you a little taste of that here. In a richly crafted scene of a banquet organized to celebrate both the passing of a century between the arrival of the Beni Halal and the marriage of their prince to the daughter of Jem. This story is much more complicated, but I didn't realize how little time I was given. I'm joking. We're treated to descriptions of clothing from India, Basra, Morocco, Serbia, Afghanistan, with flags flying in colors of Sanhaja red, Shiite green, and Sunni black, the standard colors of the Fatimids and the Abbasids. Instruments of food from Phoenicia, foods with Phoenician, Coptic, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Persian, Turkish origins, people from Zab, Tripoli, Kafsa, and Gabas, all mixed harmoniously. And what I want to say is that what he's doing here is contesting the old Arab literary narrative that the Beni Halal were destructive in North Africa. What he's seeing here is the migration out of the Arabian Peninsula and into Tunisia, to North Africa, in fact creating a North African identity that's made up of all of these. And here I want to just, here the pan-Arab, pan-Muslim Tunisian nationalist Sanusi recalls an ancestral memory through an imagined past in ways similar to Louis Bertrand and other Latin Africanist novelists, to contain a hybrid and indeterminate present and redirect it towards an ideologically coherent future. My point is that these texts are written for the present and for the future, and this is something that was brought up a little bit earlier. His third text is a Robinson Crusoe, Sinbad-type story of a Tunisian fisherman from Kerkena who gets lost at sea and ends up off the shores of North Africa, and where he ends up marrying a local girl, and a ship comes in later to rescue him, and he decides to stay. I will conclude. The geographical shift from a classical Mediterranean to a Saharan Mediterranean carries with it political messages simple enough to decode. Sanusi contests the shape of Ifriqiya as Roman province and redraws its boundaries to include areas beyond European reach. In ways parallel to Bertrand's project to strengthen and justify Europe's reclamation of Mare Nostrum by reaching as far north into the Italian Piedmont to expand the boundaries of a European Mediterranean society, we see Sanusi also redrawing the Mediterranean landscape to include the African interior. He invokes the desert as shared space and coastal trade routes, as well as Muslim centers of learning such as Mauritania and Timbuktu, in which the Tijani Sufis disseminated their teachings, bringing into his mapping the North Atlantic Ocean to resist, challenge, and best a Latinist claim to Mediterranean history. Conclude. Sanusi's fiction, as treated above, illustrates graphically the point that Arabic writing, fiction and nonfiction, was expansive in both historical and artistic scope. Its works interrogated European, even Arabo-Islamic and Mediterranean histories and embraced their political, religious, and cultural ruptures and continuities, exposing themselves to influences from classical, medieval, and modern models. His literature, unlike much of Francophone literature that ignored the faceless and voiceless Arab, opted for a strategy of direct confrontation with the European colonial other, to contest European hegemony and assert Arab identity. It was an ideologically loaded literature, like its Latinist counterpart, often chauvinistic, careless at times with historic accuracy and generic strictures, but one nevertheless that espoused contemporary humanist and democratic ideals. Sanusi's fiction, like that of his Tunisian cohorts, was Mediterranean in its worldview, rejecting a monolithic, a unified Mediterranean, but imagining it as a shared space or contact zone in which competing cultures, forced by proximity and overlap, possess a long history punctuated by wars and peaceful coexistence. The experiences of French colonialism, German duplicity, and Italian fascism that were all important to Sanusi's life, as negative forces in his own life, gave Sanusi's literary project its strong, realpolitik, if I can use that word, dimension. His literary oeuvre drew heavily from an historical consciousness and an artistic sensibility colored by contemporary politics, but one very much with the eye to the future, which I could explain later. Thank you. Did I?
So, questions? Can't see a thing. Nick, we have a question right here.
You concluded by saying with an eye to the future, which I can explain later, so could you?
Yeah. This morning, Elliot raised a question. Some of my literary work, or a good part of my literary work, has also included how, for instance, modern Arabic writers, poets, filmmakers look at Al-Andalus as a way of understanding. And when I first started out, I looked at Henri Perez's great work on Arab Muslims traveling to Spain. And it became obvious that in my interpretation and my reading is that when Arabs are looking at the past, they're not interested at all in the past. They're very much interested in looking at the present. And the idea is that the past provides lessons, and it also provides fodder to critique what's going on now. So I think that much of this looking back at the past is a way of understanding what's going on today, particularly in colonial context. With this idea with the Mediterranean, again, I think that, and I've given this paper before, and I've had people criticize it, particularly the Francophones wanting to know, did actually Sanusi read this particular novel? Is there a paper trail between these languages? And this is always a problem for literary historians when people study literature. The idea is that I think that there is an interface here. I think that both men are doing the same thing. They're both claiming space here, and I think that their audience is for the people around them. I think that Bertrand, who lived throughout the several decades of the 20th century, understood that French intellectualism was getting more and more anti-colonial, and that the wave was moving away from Algérie française. And I think that his mission was to try to address people directly that this is our turf. In the same way that I think that Sanusi was also addressing his own Tunisian compatriots. This is where we belong, not back in the Hijaz. So this is what I think this is about. So that's where I see the aspect of the future in it. Did I answer your question?
And Mike is coming your way.
Go easy on me, Julia.
Spectacular, all of you. So, you know, what I'm really interested in now is the archaeological digs that have been undertaken first in Algeria, but extensively in Tunisia and Carthage from the 1870s on, often by what would become the Père Blanc, by the religious orders. And by 1900, there's a lot, and the Tunisians actually participated as equals in some of these digs and actually formed their own archaeological society. So I'm just wondering if any of this feeds into, because we have Louis Bertrand and Sanusi just around the turn of the century sort of embracing these ideas that I agree with you, they're out there. There's a much larger cohort of people who are producing and generating and participating in these ideas and disseminating them. So I just wondered if you've come across anything to do with archaeology and archaeological knowledge.
Not in any sustained way, but yes, it comes in, it peppers in some of the texts as well.
All right, we'll talk some more.
Okay, Elliot?
Yeah, I have a question. Since we're talking about imagination and fiction, and that works, I think, differently than, say, the sort of historical research of the others on the panel. there seems to be a recurring trope of, you mentioned something called the Saharan Mediterranean, which made me think that, at least for some writers that I know of in North Africa, I'm thinking especially of, say, Ibrahim al-Kuni, that North Africa is situated between two seas, and that rather than seeing and maybe the thing is, to go back to a theme from the first panel, this conceiving of these spaces as barriers or mediating spaces, or right. It's certainly for some writers from North Africa, the desert is not a barrier, it's not a frontier. It's actually what it is, the sea that connects North Africa to the land. And I'm wondering in what sense is that relevant to Senussis, right?
Yeah, and the period in which I'm writing, what you're talking about comes out more articulately later on. I mean, Francophone writing, I didn't talk much about other Francophone writing, but it's my contention that Francophone writing in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia prior to 1951, and I'll explain 1951 in a second, is pretty much the same, for all intents and purposes. As much as Moroccans, Algerians, and Tunisians love to think of themselves as being very different, their Francophone writing is similar. It's only until 1951 with Fils du Pauvre, I think, when Mawlud Fer'oun writes his famous work, where Algerian Francophone writing will take off politically in a very different direction. What you're talking about comes a little bit later, and I don't see that happening in that sense, that this idea of the desert is something that is very powerful in North African writing. There is an Algerian novel by Ben Hadouga called, I forgot the name, it's the Qorat Bint something from the, it's the nickname for the Hijaz in classical Arabic. Someone can help me. It's a novel about an Algerian who moves from Mecca to North Africa. And there's also Muhammad Senussi, who's Senussi's father, wrote a three-part Rehla Hijaziya when he did his trip. But the 20s and the 30s was really not a time when North African writers, either Francophone or Arabophone, were looking in that direction. They were urban, and they were very, very preoccupied with or challenged by the colonial experience. So this is why I found this novel, The Muhajir. I'm sorry, it's a short story in a collection of Senussi. I found it quite interesting in the sense that why did he go back and do this? Because this is not common in this particular period of time. But that's, I attribute that to what I think is his project. He's trying to cover all bases, so to speak, in the sense that, we are, if you want to make connections to, the Piedmont, then we can make connections here as well. It's my sense. Did I answer your question?
You did. Yeah, absolutely. I guess the other question I have has to do with representations of the sea. You mentioned Camus, and certainly I remember a scene there. Where the sea is, but of course, say in Mahmoud Darwish, the sea is, do you have, I mean, these are two places, two very different writers. This is not what your paper is.
No, but to give an example, I mean, Ali Douaji, who was a cohort of Senussi, wrote this very incredible romance novel about a Sicilian fisherman whose fiance is kidnapped by Arab tradesmen, and taken off by the sea, and he gets on his little boat and does one of these kinds of, small trip across the treacherous sea, and he comes to Tunis, and he's met at Bardo, and he meets up with the fiance, and they get married in St. Louis Church, Saint Louis, the Cathedral of Saint Louis and stuff. It's more complicated than that, but there are lots of cases in Tunisian writing in which the Mediterranean it's a duality of looking at it. There's this kind of big, hostile, dark, foreboding thing, and it was also a place of linkage. And I think that even going back to Ibn Hamdis, my work that I do on medieval work, the sea was always that place that connects one to homeland. And even though he was exiled from Sicily, the sea is always ambiguous in the sense that it is dangerous because people drown in the sea. And Ibn Hamdis's favorite Jadia, Jawhara, was killed, was drowned in the sea. And he writes poetry about it as well. So there's that mix to it. But as much as the sea is foreboding and it's treacherous and it's dangerous, it also links Tunisian consciousness to a European consciousness that is celebrated in much of Tunisian literature. This connection with Italy is very, very, very powerful in ways that we just don't quite understand yet. So, just as a quick anecdote, when my first year in Tunisia, there were all these things going on where young Tunisians were being arrested for drug smuggling in France and in Italy. And the Tunisian Arabic newspapers kept constantly writing about the Italian jails. Being an Italian, I was a little sensitive. I said, look, these things are happening in France as well. Why are you constantly obsessed about writing about the Italian police arresting Tunisians in Italy? And one Tunisian said to me, because the Tunisians are us, they should know better. And it was
Italians are us.
The Italians,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. The Italians are us. We're the same people. They should know better. And that's a powerful thing that comes in and out in a lot of these texts of this particular period.
Thank you, Bill. So our next and final speaker is my colleague, Timothy Beach, here at Georgetown.
No. We're going to be changing directions here pretty dramatically. I'm going to try to make the connections between these enriching language, literature, cultural aspects of the Mediterranean and its dirt. So you'll have to bear with me as we get this going. Here we go. There we are. Okay, go ahead. It's all right. You just put it up there. There we go. From the start, it's good. Yeah, good. And I will also give you some background on somebody who knew Farrukh Tabak and worked with him here at Georgetown. I didn't work with him, but I talked with him many times before. I was a senior fellow at Dumbarton Oaks, not too far from here, while he was his last year here. And we had many walks around Dumbarton Oaks during that time talking about things that were going to go on in the future and new projects he was going to work on and potentially new projects we could work on together. My favorite picture is this drawing of Farrukh because it's kind of an incantation of his personality and his love for all things books and even to discuss things like soils and red wine with me. So this is a beginning, a tribute to Farrukh, and then a discussion of the Mediterranean valleys, and a little bit on the waning of the Mediterranean, his book, and my own case study from almost 20 years of research in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hatay. So in this tribute to Farrukh Tabak, I want to say a couple of things. You don't know him probably as much as I do. I know him through his students. He was probing and prickling and parrying with the students all the time. And he was always pushing them, but they loved him. I couldn't imagine students loving one professor much more than they loved this prickling character, always pushed him to the edges. Amazing character. His colleagues, he was always critical and collegial. I think Professor McNeil earlier talked about his criticality on a number of things. He'd always ask me questions, many of which I couldn't answer about different aspects of environmental change. I always found those to show the great depth of his own reading and learning, that he could bring in and ask things that I hadn't read about the Mediterranean, that I thought I knew about the environment of the Mediterranean. And I also would like to add something about his reputation in Turkey, because I was very fortunate to be able to give a talk in Bilgi University. Professor McNeil was there as well, after he had passed away. And he was really an interestingly well-known public intellectual figure in Turkey, well-known by many people. Many people asked me about him. They'd read this legendary figure and about him, even before his book came out. So here's a little bit of this background here, this picture again. And I always think of this Rumi quote when I think of him. He was an extremely humble person, but a very learned one, and a very nutritious one as well. He loved food, but he also provided a lot of nutrients to the rest of us. So as Rumi said, in modesty and humility, be like the soil. So we'll come back to the soil. I'm going to start off with a very long diagram. This is a diagram that shows the development of something called the Anthropocene, which is the new geological period where humans have taken over the Earth. We're now the largest influence on geomorphology, on climate now, and on many other things. We now control nature in a large way. This is a graph by one of my professors who put in this long-term Earth-moved influences, and Rome is down here. You'll see I'll come back to this. My other area of research is the Maya region, and so Copan is over here on this graph, and we'll come back to this later and show you how this changes. One of the other things I want to start off with is because it's such a prominent thing in Tabak's work is the Little Ice Age, and try to bring it to life. The Little Ice Age, this is the very end of the Little Ice Age, where glaciers had expanded out of their mountain valleys and were far down past where they had been for a long period of time. And this is 2011 in the same spot, showing these glaciers had melted back and showing what a different environment it was. But it was different all around the world, in fact. It was a world-changing event, the Little Ice Age, after what we call the medieval warming anomaly. And it was due to some interesting things. It may be simply a stochastic thing. It may be a statistical change in the atmosphere. It may be something called the NAO, which none of you have ever heard of before, the North Atlantic Oscillation, which drives climate of the Mediterranean dramatically. And we've only learned that really in the last 20 years or so. This just show a couple of cartoons of what drives this. But what was interesting is it looks like this rare negative North Atlantic Oscillation dominated that period for several hundred years, driving storms from the North Atlantic into the Mediterranean and creating a much colder Northern Europe, a Northern Europe where skating could occur throughout the winter time period in places that you can't skate now. And so this happened. It's going to come back, potentially could come back unless global warming stops this kind of reaction again in the future. Volcanism was definitely stronger during that time period. We have lots of evidence for more volcanic eruptions, and we also have evidence for some significant solar fluxes. So we have lots of good reasons for this, and we're beginning to get a handle for future environmental historians to look at this topic. I'm going to throw this up because geoscientists love to throw up these kind of maps and graphs and models of the world. But what it shows on the top up here is the medieval climatic anomaly, and what it shows at the bottom is the Little Ice Age. And blue indicates a lot colder, so you can see this is really a global event. The medieval climatic anomaly, it depends on where you are, but it's not as global an event as is this Little Ice Age, which is clearly global. The next thing I wanted to show you was, these are graphs then of, in this case, I want to show you the whole Holocene, the last 12,000 years, showing this incredible cold glacial period 12,000 years ago, warming up to the warmest period. And then what I want you to think about and see is that it's cooled off through the whole Holocene. And the bottom, the nadir of that was in the Little Ice Age. This was the coldest period in 12,000 years. And the only thing that brought us out of this is probably the Anthropocene. It's probably human-induced changes. Otherwise, we would have gone back into a full glacial period again. And so this is a really important point in time, and I'm very glad that people like Tabak are reading the broader scientific literature and bringing it into literary stories, because it is important in that case. A number of these other graphs up here show very similar things. These are out of some of the more recent. This just came out from a couple of weeks ago in Science magazine. Now, there are a few holisms, I think, about the Mediterranean and its environment, and this gets at this connectivity conceit of the last of our topics here, since I'm talking about the connectivity of ecology. They're reasonably similar climates. Everybody who has traveled around there knows there's a lot of variability in that, but there are similarities. But one of the things that I really enjoy about the Mediterranean is that it's all covered by Saharan dust. So getting back to this point somebody else made about the Saharanization of the Mediterranean, it's doing that in terms of soils, in terms of sediment. And it's a lot more fertile place because of those Saharan dusts, by the way, too. significantly more fertile. We can see them, we can add them up and see how much they've accumulated in different parts across the whole Mediterranean world. If you haven't been in southern Turkey during one of those storms that brings in Saharan dust and deposits it all over the landscape, then you haven't lived. Terra Rosa soils are the quintessential soil of the Mediterranean, this incredible red, beautiful soil which can be quite fertile. And then the next point I'm going to make is the connection to my own work in the Caribbean, because just as much the Sahara brings in this nutritious dust into the Mediterranean, it does the same thing into the Caribbean. And in fact, the soils of the Caribbean have many similarities because they come from the Sahara in the same way. The same red terra rosas occur in both places, and we can actually now quantify those impacts. Here's some terra rosas. Those of you who've traveled around the Mediterranean, you've seen these before, these incredible red soils that are quite fertile. They're variably fertile. And here's a terra rosa in the Yucatan, where I've been working for 20 plus years, only 20 years in the Mediterranean. But they're very similar chemistries and formation, even though they're in significantly different climates, a tropical versus a Mediterranean climate. Now, another holism about the Mediterranean is the holism of valley fills and coastal progradation. One of the things we found is that many of the ancient sites, the Greek and earlier sites, were ports 2,500 years ago or even 4,000 years ago, but are now miles from the ocean because of sedimentation, from erosion in the watersheds in many of these places. Tabak talks about that in terms of its impact from the Little Ice Age. That is, from all that sediment eroding down, moving out onto those floodplains, increasing the area of wetlands, creating potentially environments for the Anopheles mosquito along the way. A lot of that started much earlier, so Troy and Ephesus and many others. Another big change and holistic change of the Mediterranean was brought forward by a fellow named Claudio Vitafinzi, who showed that despite all the complexity of the Mediterranean, if you look in the sediment profiles, it's pretty simple. There's red soil below and gray and brown soil above in many places. And what he said was the red soil was pre-Roman and the brown soil was post-Roman. It sounds simplistic, but what he was getting at was he thought it was the large climatic changes of the increased rainfall of the post-Roman period that he thought drove that change. Since then, many of the scholars who've worked on this believe it's actually human-induced change, but now we're coming back to a complicated picture of both human-induced erosion as well as increased climatic instability. So here's some pictures then of these are the old layers of the coast at 500 BC, 100 AD, 550, and 1500. So you can see that Little Ice Age did add in a lot of swampy areas that became wetland areas, that became perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes, and may have driven people out of these areas. But remember, they weren't there for very long if they had been, because there wasn't land there for very long. And here's the famous Vitafinzi's image here of this Roman red soil and the gray and brown soils above this from the Amuk Plain, just off the Mediterranean. And here's a famous diagram from Karl Butzer. And he ascribed this, Karl Butzer did, not to the climatic changes that occurred after the Roman period, and not to human-induced erosion, but in fact the removal of people who had built terraces out of this landscape, and they were no longer there to actually build up the landscapes of Lebanon and of Turkey and other places. And so those terraces fell apart as the people moved out. So it wasn't human-induced ecological degradation, but rather it was a lack of humans building up and maintaining their landesque capital. So here's my particular site, a little place called Kinet, Hoyuk, here in the Bay of Iskenderun. In this region, quite fascinating region. Here's the mountains, the Almanos Mountains here in the background, and then an image, a DEM image of this mountain range over here that juts out of the Mediterranean in the Bay of Iskenderun. And I put myself in here because I always tell these audiences, because you're literary people, that geosciences loves to read stuff as well. And we like to get into the archives, but we really would rather get into soil pits. Preferably with a good book like The Waning of the Mediterranean. Our site is a little little Hoyuk over here, this mound out in this case, which in the Bronze Age was right at the coast, and the river was coming right out in this area, and it looks something like this. Here's where this tell is now in this orchard over here. And my students are over here studying an ancient soil in this, on our excavation, and then here's a topographic map of that site we looked at. Archaeologists tend to want to look right at the tell. They're interested in this area. Geomorphologists, we want to look across this landscape, so we start digging all over this landscape, moving a lot of dirt along the way. Here are tells that we're looking at. Now we're finding our old river channels and old river levels, and we're trying to figure out, when did those rivers actually fill in? Was it Tabak's Little Ice Age, creating all the sediment flowing down, or was it something during the Roman period or even earlier periods of time? We looked at a lot of historical documents. This place comes into history especially in the cuneiforms, which the ominous mountains are talked about, and the kind of wood that's coming out of them is talked about. And it comes in especially during the Battle of Issus here in 333 BC. And so there are some interesting historical time periods, a much deeper history, longer history than we've been looking at so far. But that's the kind of history we want to look at in environmental histories, to look at the long-term big drivers. And so I have to show you pictures of dirt. So you'll bear with me for a while. My wife is at the bottom, so she's smiling here as we're excavating down further and further. And what we found when we excavated off of this tell and away from this area is to develop a model for how this landscape formed over time, because what we found was buried cities underneath this sediment. These are Hellenistic walls from a house over here. Hellenistic walls buried on this cut bank. It's always fun to work in these Turkish valleys because children are always following you around and wanting to help. They find these things, but they always take them out of context. It drives you crazy. And we found things like this excavation showing this massive Roman road, the imperial road that ran through the Hatay to Antioch, Antakya, and my students working across this. And this diagram then kind of concludes all of this work that we have on it, because what it shows is that underneath these various levels, there's Iron Age tell here, there are Bronze Age sections, is an incredible amount of Roman and Hellenistic sediment. It appears that not the Little Ice Age, as Tabak would have it in this particular site, but the Roman period, or the just post-Roman period, is when most of this sediment flooded down, buried these cities, and left only the Hoyuk, only the tell sticking out. So people would come and they would see, well, there's just a tell. That's where everybody lived. Nobody could have lived in the plains because there's nothing left. But that's because everything was buried by meters and meters and meters of sediment, even back to Roman times. And so, of course, we had to follow that into the uplands, because we like to go in the uplands and follow things through into the ominous mountains, which have a lot of nice PKK activity in them, which makes it hard to work in. Looking at these soil sequences and getting evidence for when these soils move down these slopes. Here's the old red soil again. Not that dissimilar, actually, to what Vidas Vinci said in 1969, and all this gray and brown soil above it. And what we found were some of those Roman terraces that Butzer had talked about in some places along the way. In a lot of places, however, we found the Roman terraces had been blown out by erosion, and what was left behind were gullies and eroded sediment layers and a very eroded landscape, which had been the Roman Landes capital, the built-up landscape that was very productive with fertile soils. And it had either eroded away during the Roman period or at post-Roman period, but we now think it's probably mostly post-Roman period. It's probably mostly due to people not protecting these landscapes. And this diagram then shows this final kind of diagram of the upland landscape, showing the erosion post-Roman, the sediment building up behind these buried Roman terraces and roads. These gullies you see up here are gullies that are occurring in this landscape right after, we think, the Roman period. I'm going to go ahead and say that this so-called migration period from, say, 300 or 250 or so to 500 is one that had a tremendous amount of precipitation increase. It's very significant. Temperature is varying through that time period. So this humanized landscape with its terraces and devegetation and olive trees that had been there for hundreds of years also was hit with extreme temperature change and more rainfall than before, and that caused most of that change. In fact, if we look at that, this long-term curve, which had Rome down here below, I think we can put Rome back towards the middle on this way up to the modern US and its degradation and the formation of the Anthropocene, on a par with the Maya area that I'm working on, which also shows this a much greater change that's occurring. And I think there's lots of evidence for the Little Ice Age still being a strong impact on the Mediterranean, but it depends on where you are in the Mediterranean, where the Little Ice Age really plays out. My part of the Mediterranean, it was really Roman by far. And so lastly, I come back to Farouk again here and say, for years, you've been a stony-hearted man. Try being like the soil now, if you can. The importance of grand synthesis is what Farouk did, because new connections may come that answer questions, and more importantly, for those of us who want to continue on doing this work, produce a lot more questions. So we can go out and more of those soil profiles and work on them. The Mediterranean is even more part of a world system than Tabak supposed, because of its source of dust and because of the impacts of the world system that influence the Mediterranean as well. Eruptions in 536 AD, which changed the Mediterranean climate and may be associated with those climatic deteriorating conditions that I showed on that graph before. The problem always in science, as it is in social science and literature, are equifinalities. What we see in the landscape may have all sorts of different things that led to it in different ways during that time, and it's hard to say whether it was Roman or post-Roman because the dating is usually too wide, its resolution is not good enough. Now, the twist is a possible driver of the Little Ice Age that Farouk Tabak wrote so much about is the carbon uptake that occurred in the Americas after the American population declined so dramatically with the conquest of the Americas. With 90+% of the American population declining, forest exploded back, sucked carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's still an ongoing possibility, a crazy but possible hypothesis to throw out to the next great synthesizer like Farouk Tabak to look at. Thank you very much.
So, questions? Yes, please. Gets to the Caribbean?
And I saw one of those restaurants who came all the way to Istanbul when I was there last year. I don't understand how dust from the Sahara can have this tremendously nutritious aspect to it.
Well, yeah, if you look at it, a lot of the dust, there's been a tremendous amount of work on the chemistry of that dust. And so when you look at it, there's a lot of iron in it, there's calcium in it, there are a lot of other things that add to these soils that are so heavily used by humans for so many centuries, that this stuff is coming back down in and really for free refertilizing. Not fertilizing enough, you still have to fertilize these landscapes, but they are getting a substantial fertilization from that, as is, I say, the Caribbean. We see these evidence for these dusts at Tikal, even. Most of it's not, but there's some even in the central Maya lowlands.
Yes, Julia. Yes,
Thank you. Hi. That was a wonderful talk. I just wanted to say, I have to say this, and you're going to laugh, Osama, but I think that Rome is highly overrated. And that, you know what I'm going to say, that Carthage gets excised from, and the Romans learned about the sea, and they also learned about agriculture from the Carthaginians. Remember those 38 volumes of agriculture by Mago that they then took, and anyway, we won't go there. But I'm really concerned with soil in the wrong place. In other words, silting. And this morning I sort of sketched out rise and fall of a particular Mediterranean port city, which was also a courser capital. And then we find at the end of the Little Ice Age, its access to the sea silts up because there's a major radical shift in a river system, the only river system in Tunisia, the Majerda. And this is just a question of a non-scientist to someone who knows something. Is it possible, are there other examples of, thinking of equifinality, are there other examples of major river systems shifting, in a big way and then leading to silting up, sort of at the
Yeah,
end of
it's
the
a
little
very,
ice age?
very common thing. Rivers are wild serpents that you can't restrain.
But
You know,
yeah,
there's
but
an
this-
example of the Yellow River moving 200 kilometers overnight at times in the past, completely changing where it was going.
So there's, I mean,
Plenty of, and it's fascinating things that environmental historians or historians should take up, I think, are questions, because it hasn't been studied enough by historians to look at what are the human consequences and how humans are reacting to these kind of, the term we use for this is an avulsion. I don't know if you've heard that terminology before, but like vulsion with an A in the front of it. And rivers are very commonly switch around like that. I shouldn't overstate it, but one of the reasons why the Army Corps of Engineers in the United States spends so many billions of dollars is to try to keep the Mississippi from moving where it is and moving entirely away from New Orleans and leaving New Orleans high and dry, because it would tomorrow if we didn't put millions of dollars every year into blocking it.
so my hypothesis.
Lots of potential for a new hypothesis.
Nick, there's a question down here. I'm sorry if there's someone else that I'm not seeing. One down here and then one back up there after it.
Thank you very much. A really fascinating talk. You mentioned that the Little Ice Age had different repercussions all over the Mediterranean. So could you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting thing, and I think it's, again, another useful thing historians, literary people should start to bring into their thoughts about it. Not that I'm by any stretch of the imagination an environmental determinist, but I do think environmental change does influence people, and they have to react in different ways. But one of the things that's clear is when it goes into this negative phase, the North Atlantic Oscillation, you get this direct flow of the North Atlantic into the Mediterranean. And so you get an accentuated precipitation pattern, and it throws off the seasons significantly, so you start getting rains when you don't expect to get them. You know, during the summer period when you wouldn't expect to, you're getting more rainfall occurring during those time periods. But you have a line between where it's rainier and wetter and cooler, mainly because there's more cloud cover, and the line where it's just colder and probably wetter just because it's so much colder that the air can't hold much moisture. And that line is somewhere in France. In France and Spain, it's going back and forth. And this would be a really interesting thing for people to start exploring, that part of the Mediterranean that is getting colder because of this versus rainier. But it's a really important period. This is the conclusion of the Holocene attempting to move itself back into a full-on glacial period, but then, I think, stopped by humans in the Anthropocene, pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And the carbon dioxide doesn't get high enough until you get to the very end of the Little Ice Age. I think that there are other drivers, too. I don't think that there's only one driver. The North Atlantic Oscillation is a good explanation for it, though. But I do think that you have some more general cooling, as you saw in that global pattern. It was very clear that the globe had cooled maybe a degree Celsius or so on that order during that time period. And I think that was just part of that natural trend of the whole of the last 12,000 years. Although I am impressed, I'm going beyond what you asked, but I am impressed by the literature looking at this carbon getting sucked up by these forests regrowing in the Americas. In this broader world system.
You have a question back there?
Hi, thank you. So I'm just wondering if again, a question about dust. If Saharan dust going to the Caribbean can at all explain or partially explain the shift in sort of sugar production from North Africa to the Caribbean and at some point during the Little Ice Age.
Well, the Caribbean, a lot of the soils in the Caribbean would tend to be pretty low nutrient status because they're very leach tropical soils. And there's no question that there's getting more soil material dropped down upon those landscapes. So it would be an area that they could begin to exploit and start using because of the nutrients that are there that wouldn't have been there without those currents, those air currents bringing those dusts in. Some of the Caribbean is also fertilized by volcanic activity too, and both of which are bringing in real nutrients. Volcanoes bring in usually even better nutrient sediments. if you get farther over into Central America, the soils under the tropical forests of Central America should be low fertility because most tropical forest soils are very low fertility, but they're quite fertile. In fact, they're thick and black because of these combination of things. So you could say that to some degree. They're certainly taking on soils. There are groups that had used them before, but not at the intensity levels of sugar plantations as well, or tobacco a little bit farther north. Yeah.
Thanks. That was really fascinating, and particularly the carbon uptake little twist at the end there. So there has been a certain amount of work, as I'm sure you're aware, on the history of deforestation as a global phenomenon. And there's a wonderful book called Deforesting the Earth as a sort of a general overview of that. And John McNeill here has done some work on the Mediterranean in the midst of this period that Farooq then situates his book in. So, but what I want to do is to try and just sort of match up the climate data and the causality supposition that he unfurls with other things, including the deforestation aspect, in which human intervention is the primary driver of this deforestation. And the early modern period, which corresponds roughly to the end of this Little Ice Age phase, is globally is a period in which there is massive deforestation for a whole series of different reasons. A lot of it having to do with construction of ships of all kinds. So it's a big period for navigation, not just in the Atlantic, but also in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean world. And so it has huge impacts on forests. In places like Japan, where we have pretty good histories of deforestation, it's a period in which, as in Europe in this period, and in the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere, there are major construction projects by empires and emerging states that are busy whacking away on forests and constructing their own little palaces and not so little palaces and fortress complexes and all that goes with it. And then there's a whole sort of economic uptake in terms of exchange, largely fueled by not so much land trade, but by seaborne trade because of all these new ships and because of their efficiencies in the ways in which ship construction have evolved by this time. There's new commercial highs, and sort of all of this is not in sequence with a declinationist narrative of the impact of the Little Ice Age, which would tend to help us conclude that somehow it's really bad news for the world and for the Northern Hemisphere in particular. And that kind of an evidence doesn't seem to work that way. It's also a period in which, warfare and state formation are just going on globally in very major ways, and more forest whacking behind it, because we're still not in the age of fossil fuels and coal. So how are we going to do all the metallurgy that's responsible for manufacturing these cannon and various other implements of warfare, right? So again, it feeds back into the deforestation project, but it also changes the whole sort of political trajectory of much of Eurasia, if not the planet as a whole. So I guess what I'm edging towards is being somewhat skeptical of a hypothesis that situates the Little Ice Age as being a major driver, because it's in spite of it. Everybody's having to put up with the Little Ice Age in one way or another in the Northern Hemisphere, everywhere, all the way to China. We also are beginning to have histories of the Little Ice Age even in its impact on China and Japan. So it's not just an Atlantic world thing at all. And it is this other period of it's a really remarkable new phase for humanity, still in the solar energy age, to sort of push way beyond frontiers that had previously existed in no-go zones and Malthusian curves and all the rest of it. So anyway, Little Ice Age, I'm not so persuaded.
You're not the only one. I put it out as a hypothesis that I think is interesting because the modeling's not in yet. So if we look at the modeling for trying to figure out, we don't know exactly how much area is afforesting, right? So if you try to begin to model that, you can start to model how much carbon's getting taken out of the atmosphere by the afforestation, and then wind as coal start to really kick in, right? Pumping carbon back into the atmosphere. And so the modeling is confused in that, but one thing you do see is you definitely see a downtick in carbon in the atmosphere during that time period. The question always with carbon in the atmosphere, however, and the last thing I'll say, I guess, on that, because it looks like we're running out of time because I'm getting some looks to suggest that, is it due to deforestation or is it due to colder temperature and less active photosynthesis going on at that time period? It's a very difficult group of modeling that people are working on right now, and it's a very active but very critical area. I want you to know that it's not fully accepted, and that's why I put it as a final twist, maybe.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to hand it over to Osama for some brief closing remarks.
Thank you. Sorry, Tim, that we are past the time, so I'm going to be very brief. I just wanted to thank again all of our speakers for a wonderful symposium and excellent contributions, and also for an occasion to remember Farooq Tabak. We appreciate this deeply. I want to thank my colleagues at the CCS, but a really special thanks and congratulations to the staff and the work study of the CCS for another job very well done. And so if you will bear with me, I just want to recognize them individually. And I want to give a special thanks to Elizabeth Sexton, who is somewhere here. All right. Okay. Believe it or not, Elizabeth joined us 3 weeks ago, and we've had 4 events since then. How much?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. So even more miraculous. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I want to also thank my Associate Director, Rania Kiblawi, and Office Manager, Nicholas Hilgeman, for putting their shoulders to the wheel when we were without Elizabeth, specifically. So thank you to them. And then I want to mention the rest of the staff. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks to Zaina Azam, Steve Gertz, Kelly Harris, Lil Salimi, and Courtney Smith. All of you made this a very successful event, so thank you very much. I appreciate it. Final comment. I think it's very fitting that we also acknowledge Marina Krikorian, our former public affairs coordinator. She was here at the beginning of this planning, and it's very appropriate that she should be here at the conclusion. So thanks again to you, Marina. And that brings it, although I was going to say that, how come I always hear this, I don't mean to sound deterministic, but insert deterministic answer here. So I need to figure out why we can't get away from this determinism. But thanks very much. And I'm sorry I ran out of time. So thank you, everyone.